you. So now we are with our last speaker of the day, Ben Craggs from Goldsmiths University London.
Thank you. Okay, well, thanks for those papers beforehand, because they really they've got me thinking, and I think there's some things that I cover in my paper which would probably do with responding to and thinking about some of the things you've said. So please do make comments and tell me where I'm wrong, because this is quite speculative at the moment, and it's the first sort of draft of a chapter, really, or the sort of first outlines of a chapter for my PhD. So what it really is an attempt to look at this concept of the bio that we use in terms of biological and biopolitics, but in the context of an emerging field of bioart, and to consider how the biological and more broadly life is conceptualized in bioart. It's to ask what sense it makes to think of a medium as being alive, and whether the use of a living medium changes the status of the artwork, or indeed whether it changes what we think of as the living. So in this paper, I will consider the artistic appropriation of biotechnological practices in the field of bioart, and in particular, those practices involved in tissue culture. And that's the growth of human and non-human tissues in vitro. These are some petri dish slides, petri dishes, in which we sort of grow these tissues. Now, for me, the practice of tissue culture recontextualizes biological processes of growth and makes them available as new media. And until now, we have seen biological media like this employed in scientific and medical contexts, used to create, for example, replacement trachea, which is, so this is a medical intervention for somebody who had throat cancer. It's grown from stem cells and transplanted into the donor receiver. However, as the techniques used in tissue culture have become increasingly available to non-specialist practitioners, including artists and performers, their cultural role as media is becoming more apparent. This is the example I want to look at. It's taken pride of place in my thesis, really. It's like figuring all the way I'm thinking this through. This is by a group called the Tissue Culture and Art Project. I'm sure some of you are well aware of their work. And this is the Victimless Leather Project. In here, in this glass flask in the middle, is the tissue. And I really like this I've been thinking a bit through this weekend's conference as a kind of metabody, as an extended biotechnological body. So here we have a work that to some extent could be described as being alive. At the very least, it is partially constituted by material that is in some way living. That's the tissue in the middle. It's material that grows, reproduces, and feeds, and it needs a protective environment for its survival. You know, this technical body creates this protective environment. So why am I interested in tissue as a medium? And what does it offer the Metabody project? As a biomolecular media of living cells grown outside of a biological organism, tissue raises fascinating questions about the status of the living, where the art object itself could be said to be in some way alive. Furthermore, in relying upon these techno-scientific apparatuses for its survival, tissue, when grown in vitro like this, challenges our conventional notion of a body, forcing us to account for a metabody, a body that is continually shifting and that is simultaneously biological and technological. But more specifically, and thinking about the use of tissue within this kind of amorphous field that we're calling bioart, that I'm referring to as bioart, It seems that tissue coincides with one of the main aims for the Metabody project, because the use of tissue in bioart has been explicitly positioned as an intervention and a critique of the prevalence of cybernetics in contemporary culture, and particularly those attempts to reduce life to information. Here, the biological medium, the biological nature of this medium is itself, it's crucially important. So for one of the bioartists involved, Eduardo Cat, bioart is different because it is art in vivo. It is art embodied in life, or that uses life. And for Jonat Zur and Owen Katzen, who are the Tissue Culture and Art Project, bioart is understood explicitly as a practice where biological materials and life have become an integral part of the artistic process, as well as part of the artwork itself. Now, what I find of particular interest when considering the artistic application of tissue engineering, and explicitly as an explicitly biological medium, is how it's conceptually situated alongside other new media art and art that works primarily with digital technologies, and specifically the use of digital technologies to simulate life in silico. So these are things like artificial life. For Owen Katzen and Jonat Zur, writing in 2003, and I quote, while many artists are directing their attention to the consequences of deciphering the genetic code, this is where the distinction between life and computation seems to have collapsed, their own work, they stress, deals with another level of the biological system, that of the cell and communities of cells in tissue. Now I like this is another example of a supplementary text that goes along with the Tissue Culture and Art Project's work. And again, I just put this up as it kind of gives an idea of this metabody, this extended body in which the tissue grows. So it's technological, and it involves multiple forms of media, including photographic media, and it includes non-human and human actors in there, including a mouse. This image is actually not very clear. So, now, the bioart curator and media theorist Jens Howser has also made clearer distinction, or attempted to make a clear distinction between tissue engineering and the use of digital technologies to model life on a computer. He, quoting in a 2008 publication, for a long time now, new media art circles suggested that bioart was purportedly synonymous with genetic art, and focused on so-called genetic algorithms, visualizing data, and the simulation of biological processes. And this he illustrates with reference to the 1993 Ars Electronica Festival, which was dedicated to genetic life and artificial life, genetic art and artificial life. So at the festival, the items foremost on the agenda, he says, were computational models of biological processes, including autopoietic systems, virtual creatures, artificial life software, genetic images, synthetic life, evolution, the ecology of digital organisms, interactive evolution, and the algorithmic beauty of nature. That's actually a quote taken from the catalogue that went along with the Ars Electronica festival there. Now, one of the people involved in that was Thomas Ray, an artist who sought to evolve artworks. This is his evolved flatworm, using computational evolutionary algorithms on the computer to evolve these digital representations of living beings. Now, for Howser, these items reflected a shift in paradigms, a shift promoted by computer culture in which life ceased to be determined in terms of its substance, material hardware or mechanisms, and instead became defined as code, language, and immaterial software, and as a dynamic system. Now, crucially, Howser positions tissue-based art against this shift, suggesting that since Ars Electronica Festival, new media art has rematerialized itself. For Howser, the former fascination with the code of life is receding and making way for practices involving wet work. Sorry, that was a quote. Even more forcefully, in his chapter in Observations of Art of a Growing Interest, he suggests that the proclaimed centrality of code is being confronted with concrete, carbon-based physical reality. Now, this is where my paper fits in. While I would certainly not want to defend this code of life hypothesis, nor attempt to reinvigorate a genetic paradigm, I would argue that it is not satisfactory to simply position tissue as a correction by opposing the allegedly immateriality of code with the carbon-based reality of tissue. So the problem as I see it is that this idea of correction is actually overly invested in a specific materiality of tissue alone. And it's not just its materiality, but it's a certain messy materiality, a kind of stuffness, a physical, something you can grab, that was seen to be lacking in the dry and allegedly immaterial world of computational modelling. What is more, and as Howser's quote earlier implies, the presentation of the bio in bioart here as a messy stuff has actually become synonymous with a notion of the real, one positioned against mere representation and simulation that we saw in computer-based art. So just to reiterate, my interest here is how bioart is seen to correct and replace simple representation with real physical reality. So unlike mere representation of computer models, living, messy tissue gives us access to this carbon-based reality, or so it seems. However, the use of tissue also forces a recognition that those terms on which we begin to account for this authenticity of bioart are not themselves given. The bio in bioart is not a property of tissue, just as tissue is not an autonomous and self-directing medium. So here, I start to think about sort of tissue which seems to grow from within itself. So while at a certain level, tissue does display kind of emergent properties, which suggests a certain level of endogeny, that is, growth that comes from within, this is not the whole story. The tissue in bioart is always already part of a larger body, and that was why I put up those earlier images. The tissue requires a supplement, which does not give life to tissue, but without which its growth and its survival would not be possible. So what does this mean for bioart? Well, in part, this question is already being dealt with by those in the field itself. Those earlier claims that bioart is art in vivo do seem to be toned down. Jens Howser has recently acknowledged that what biomedia facilitate is not a convergence of art and life, but rather a new means with which just to allude to aliveness. Drawing on Eugene Thacker's concept of biomedia, he has argued that what is specific to biomedia is its ability to disguise its own technicity. The apparent aliveness of the artwork, which is made with biomedia, seems to be no more than an effect afforded the work by the artist's skillful use of these biomedia. Therefore, bioart is not art in vivo. It's really just business as usual. The application of available media to create the illusion that what we're looking at is really alive. So here, bioart, for all of its use of living and semi-living biomaterials, goes no further than what went before, computational simulations of life. Now, this is an important observation, as the various critiques of the hyperbole of cybernetics and information theory, especially as it played out in new media art, have shown, any claims having provided transparent access to the really living is fraught with problems. However, and this is my key point, while this accounts acknowledge a tool with which we can at best allude to aliveness. Now, I feel uncomfortable with this outcome, for it seems to simply invert the previous position. What was previously, I guess, a realist position, claiming that bioart was art in vivo, has now become a constructionist position, where the in vivo is merely the product of a skillful artist. But for me, both positions are unsatisfactory. And I would suggest that we need a more dynamic account that addresses the vitality of biomedia, yes, but we also need the material reality, or we need to acknowledge the material reality of representations, simulations, and models of life. We need to take account of, in addition to biomedia, these biomediations. So what's going on here? The inversion that I suggest is taking place seems to pivot on the consideration of biomedia as spatially separated objects. operating at best at the boundaries of the biological and technological, and that treats the biological and technological as ontologically discrete things. They are either biological and therefore alive, or they are technological and therefore artificial. What is left out of this account is the possibility that the biological and the technological may not just be situated as spatially separated things, but are instead mutually co-constitutive of each other. So it is here that we need to take account of, additionally, this concept of biomediation. So the limitation of attending to the artist's use of biomedia to allude to aliveness is it rests upon a static relationship where you are real on one side, and for me it's real life, and we've got we humans on the other, and between us there is a medium that either acts as a barrier for some, or for others, a window, something transparent through which we can see real life. We either perceive the real object that lies on the other side, or we see in the medium a mere reflection of ourselves. It's a classic philosophical debate. The medium either gives us an accurate representation of real aliveness, or it offers us nothing but an illusion, a simulation. So how do we deal with this? It is at this point, I would suggest, with Sarah Kember and Joanna Zielinska in their new book, that the study of media and the study of new media bioart in particular could be usefully diffracted through an interaction with accounts from science and technology studies, and in particular Karen Barrett's work on performativity and her performative realist framework that she terms agential realism. What Barrett offers is a means with which to engage with the material reality of tissue and life, but also takes account of and takes responsibility for our representations and our simulations of life, what I am calling biomediations. These representations, or biomediations, neither accurately represent life somewhere over there, nor do they simply create a barrier, substituting real life with a fake, with an illusion. In Barrett's agential realist framework, stuff matters. She's not afraid of the real world, but what the real world is, and in my articulation, what life is never a simple affair. Representations do not simply communicate something about life from a distance, but nor are they barriers and mere simulations. Both sides of this extreme return us to this tripartite relationship, a spatial separation where real life and our representations are physically, spatially separated. What Barrett suggests is that the material world and our engagement with it through observation and description remain fundamentally entangled. Here Barrett draws on the work of physicist Niels Bohr, for whom concepts are very much material actors. They do not simply describe the world, but they have a material and world-changing effect. Not in the sense of the constructionist account, that subordinates material reality to language, but instead in a way that suggests that the object of study, for me, life, and the agencies of observation or description, for me, bioart and biomediations, lack an inherent independent existence. The object of study for Bohr and for Barrett are not a construction, nor are they independently existing entities, but rather they are phenomena. And there's links here with this concept of phenomena, which I was just thinking with Stephen's work that I probably want to talk to you about. But so this concept of phenomena, where things do not exist as such, but they emerge through an interaction or an interaction between the object and the apparatuses, and the object and the apparatuses of observation are inseparable. Sorry, that wasn't very clear. So for Bohr, the phenomena that concepts both describe and co-constitute are those observable in physics. Now, I want to extend this to suggest that what life is better understood as a process and of phenomena, as an event. Not as a property attributable to an ontologically discrete entity, but rather a force that emerges through the interaction of entities. Now, these entities do include other material objects, but the interaction also extends to the concepts that we apply to those interactions, where those concepts, those articulations of the bio, are themselves entangled with material phenomena. So representation does not simply say something about life with varying degrees of accuracy, but rather, in being inseparable from the objects they purport to represent, they do something with and to life. Where for realists and constructionists alike, the representation takes on a static role, either entirely transparent or largely opaque, either a barrier or a window, for Barrett, representation takes on a dynamic role. They interact and co-constitute that which they represent. Representations do not just say something about life, but are rather thoroughly entangled with the vital process of emergence that we all too often locate in either entities or processes between entities. Now, this observation has led Kember and Zielinska to describe mediation itself as a vital process. That is to say, and I quote, an intrinsic condition of being in and becoming with the technological world. Now, the vitality of mediation takes on a particular significance when the media in use is already imbued with a certain vitality, where the medium already, because of what we currently make of life, is determined to be, if only part, alive. Mediation does not acquire its vitality because of the medium, but rather the vitality of mediation contributes to what we think of as being alive. Now, this is crucial for my argument, because it reconnects and it revives this possibility that life might exist somewhere, other than in entities themselves. Now, as I said before, in no way do I want to suggest that the reductive accounts of life that gave light to work in artificial life were simply correct. All they did was locate life in another isolated location, in information. What I want to suggest, however, is that another articulation of the bio, as a biomediation, life as information, has in part contributed to a change in what life is. And not just because life has now been corrupted and manipulated by the interventions made upon it by biotechnology, but because what life is always already inseparable from these mediations. So what is at stake here? If life is not a thing to be properly identified, and if it does not have a correct, special, fixed existence that needs to be protected, and if life is continually open to change, then how do we account for our role in that change? It would seem that if life is a phenomenon, the entangled interaction of human and non-human agency, then it's certainly not. Then we certainly cannot be entangled in this process in a position of authority and from a position of control. So in terms of art, this leads to something of a conundrum. If this process is of becoming with, what sense does it make to speak of intentionality, particularly the artist's intention? Is the artist, by virtue of their position as an artist, or indeed instead of a scientist, are they better able to intervene in this process? Now, being aware of this creative process of mediation, recognizing its productive effects, does not mean that mediation is just another tool with which the artist can shape reality. Doing so would revive the same tripart relationship, where the human or the artist is placed in a position of authority over the processes of mediation. The artist, we humans, are not apart from this process. The vitality of mediation encompasses our own inseparability from its productive functioning. I would suggest that it is here that the Metabody project offers an interesting opportunity. It's a chance to map and identify some of these interactions and to explore how life emerges through the interaction of human and non-human and material and discursive articulations. And obviously that observation, our mapping of that process, is going to contribute to, it's going to be another representation, another mediation, which will further contribute to the change in what life is. So to conclude, the Metabody project has to account for differential interactions between physical media, yes, but it has to additionally encompass the productive effects of mediation and to trace the interactions between bodily biomedia and our representations from which biomedia are inseparable. While cybernetics certainly sought to stabilize and enframe this motion, this mutability that we've been talking about, we would do well to remember that reverting to the stuff of bodies does not, in itself, open up a more vibrant future. The stuff of bodies, their messiness, remains necessarily a story, a mediation. So, just as a story of cybernetics has sought to situate life in information through the constitutive effects of storytelling, so we cannot lose sight that the vitality of matter cannot be disentangled from the vitality of mediation. To account for the vitality of matter, one cannot ignore the interaction of matter and discourse. To open up matter's potentiality, we need to take account of both stuff and stories. Okay.
Thank you so much. We have like 10 minutes for debate. Thanks for offering this wonderful new way of approaching, like, I see very close link between biomediation and metaformers. Is this, so thanks for bringing that in. Indeed, we have to look into this from that perspective as well. So let's open up, if you wish.
It came to me, it's probably come to other people already, but as we heard some of the talks earlier on, I just thought of the nice correlation between metaformance and metaphor and this storytelling and this productive, vital process of metaphors, that metaphors themselves might change in their interaction with bodies, which is why I was asking about this sort of, if the body is a memory bank, for metaphors, and we can use metaphors in that way. If the body changes, does the metaphor change in the process? So there was that link that sort of came to me, metaphor and metaformance.
Well, one of the things about metaformance is thinking in motion and thinking the world as motion. So that I think could bring things together in the sense that metaphors are part of the motion as well. So metaphors are motion, are in motion, which means for me it would be equally problematic to think of metaphors as discrete entities as it is problematic to think of body parts or whatever kind of object as a discrete entity. But then what happens when we think of it in terms of movement and a perceptual movement that allows us to mediate and become with it in an ontological kind of level? Yeah. I don't know.
I didn't want to take up too much time, but I'll bite. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the interaction presupposes change, right? I think the hard thing is that so often we're habituated into similar ideological and sort of normative contexts that the possibility for change isn't even raised, even though it is sort of entering into this transaction. A question I had is, okay, so if we're studying sort of this mediating force, right? I guess, and you don't have to answer this, but the question is how do you study this, right? I mean, is it a genealogical approach where you sort of look back and sort of how the mediations have changed and then sort of extrapolate from there? Or, yeah, I mean, because I think this is fascinating. I'm just not sure methodologically how to wrap my head around it. So.
Yeah, so I guess my approach to it has been one of genealogies. It's informed by work of J. Bolter and Richard Crusin, a book called Remediation. And that is based upon genealogies and tracing linkages and connections between media. I got really interested in bioart and this use of tissue because it seemed, when I first looked at it, when I first played with it, but this is radically different from what I did before. I was using computer modeling. And then as I looked at it, as I started to explore it, I thought, well, no, there's connections. These things are going on. How do we theorize and think about these continuities between tissue and the digital without being scared about it? Because I'm struggling with this idea that seems to come up in some bioart, that tissue is this correction, that tissue, by being material, by being stuff, is better than computation. I've just got a problem with that. They're connected. You can't disentangle these processes, particularly tissue culture. You cannot disentangle where tissue culture is culturally from computation and from the notion of the digital as well. But yeah, to answer your question, actually, it's through tracing genealogies, through looking for linkages and connections, and then trying to account for them, looking for them at moments and how they stabilize in different media. So, yeah. Should we go to dinner?
Certainly. Just like last week, I think one could, and possibly you have thought about it already, like people like Luciana Parisi are thinking about this, like how are movements actually being captured in matter, and then I would say also in the actual perception that is involved in the mediation and all the other kinetics of our of the biomediation that you were describing. How are those movements operating in different contexts, and some of them more problematically than others in terms of being captured by capitalist flows, for example? That would be one question in strictly kinetic terms. And the important link you make here is, of course, not only looking at the matter, but at the biomediation as well, which is inseparable, as you were saying, from that. So what are the movements, the kinetics of the biomediation? How is capitalism operating there in terms of capturing novelty, for example, into capitalist flows, so that even novelty now is produced as almost a non-emergent, so it's emergent in some aspects, but it's not. It's already operating at the service of a certain kind of machine, of a certain kind of capitalistic machine, for example. So, how that capture happens is one issue, and I know different people working on that from different perspectives, like Brian Masumi and Luciana Parisi. From my approach is slightly different, but resonating with them. But looking at the kinetics of that. So, well, wonderful. So thank you. Well, I don't know if you want to comment on what the last comment, or anyway, if not. Okay. So I suggest that we could go for dinner, and in fact, you're more than welcome to join. We'll go somewhere nearby. So thank you so much for this session. And tomorrow will be the last with the presentations of the projects that are hopefully nearly finished over there. Well, nothing is ever finished, is it? So, thank you.